Welcome, everyone. This Tuesday evening, my name is Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and it feels like we've at least made it to the other side of COP. Of course, it's 10 days ago already that it ended. The world still spins. There's a nip in the air, distinct nip in the air down in London. So to that extent, at least, the climate systems are still working. But I don't know, I'm still processing that 2 weeks of talk and tension. Since then, we've had the biggest ever American auction of oil and gas offshore drilling licenses. The US, some of this, by the way, is reported by Barney in today's Net Zero Sensemaker. The US has decided to release tens of millions of barrels from its petroleum reserves. We've heard that sales of private jets and super yachts have seldom been higher. And the usual suspects in the US Senate are playing games with what would be the biggest American spending package on climate mitigation and adaptation in history. So a bit of a reality check is the context. We're trying to do two things this hour. One is to have our regular Tuesday evening open news meeting with Tortoise colleagues and Tortoise members. Welcome all those of you who are here and will join over the course of the hour. But also this is doing double duty as our first post-COP Accelerating Net Zero Coalition meeting. So to that extent, we're all wearing two hats, but to one goal, which is to work out collectively what Tortoise should be reporting on next, what we made of COP. I'm basically inviting everyone to say what you think was achieved, what should have been but wasn't, what did we learn, what should we at Tortoise journalistically pursue. And I'm very conscious, as I think we all were there, especially when we stepped out of the blue zone, and many of us at Tortoise spent a lot of time in the New York Times Climate Hub that we were sharing, that COP isn't the only game in town, so let's bear that in mind. And I'd be interested to know general views on whether it is the solution or only part of the solution or actually part of the problem. We, just to remind everybody of the promises that we made, well, we wrote a list of questions together that we hoped COP would help answer. We promised to write a to-do list for the planet afterwards, which sounds glib, but I make no apology for it, because I think that even though many people will be producing equivalents, it is always useful to have a sort of laminated list that you can stick in your pocket and carry around with you of irreducible essentials that we've all agreed need to be done. Let's face it, after Paris, we came away with two words, net zero. And I think there was general agreement that they were two useful words. So even if it seems very boiled down and reductive, I'm all in favor of a boiled down list, to-do list. So we promised we'd come up with that. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, at Tortoise, we want more broadly to identify storylines, subjects that we need to pursue, places we need to go, assuming we can. As a reminder, we want to hear from everybody. Get stuck in the chat. Barney is paying attention there. Do raise your electronic hands. And Barney has just showed that you can raise your real hand as well, and we'll notice you, or we'll try to. But let me start by coming to Friederike Andres. Friederike and Stephen Lorimer have both sort of agreed to come along, knowing that they will be put in the crosshairs. But Friederike, you are a policy advisor with the Federation of Small Business, and you've done quite a lot of sort of consultation with your members. And I was reading this afternoon that your position is, your impression is from polling them, that climate considerations have moved from nice to have to must have. But let me ask you sort of very bluntly, is it not still the case, if you're running a small business, that climate, doing the right thing by climate remains a cost that you would prefer others, government, to bear? Or have we moved beyond that?
We've seen that we've definitely moved beyond that. So the research you're referring to is our net zero report that was published actually on the second day of COP. So we kind of tried to tie that in with COP and hosted our first national big conference on net zero with our members as well. And what we've seen doing, our consultation with members and also through the survey that we ran over the summer is that the businesses in this country, the small businesses, they recognize there is a climate emergency. They see there is a climate crisis. We asked specifically, not just climate change, but we wanted to know, is there a climate crisis? And do you think you can do something? A lot of businesses say they can do something. They've done already something. So 1/3 have either made a plan or have made changes to the business. And at the moment, what's holding most of them back is the fact that there are the barriers that they can't overcome in order to actually be more sustainable. So they want to do more. And they know that they have the responsibility to do something, to be more sustainable, to work with their employees and their staff members. But there are, for instance, in recycling, there are barriers that they can't overcome. There are, limits to funding. It's not that they don't necessarily want to invest, but sometimes it's just it's a big investment, for instance, in heat pump or an EV. And these are the barriers that are holding them back. If they could, they would do more, but it's more the barriers that are preventing them.
Okay, so I want to move on in a second to ask you how many of your members regard this as a business opportunity. But just on the barriers, let's get to the nitty gritty. What do they need in terms of recycling? Is it like our domestic problem when we fill up our green bin?
So a lot of businesses don't have, there are a couple of exemptions, but the majority of small businesses don't have access to council collection of waste and recycling. Obviously, it depends on the type of waste you produce as a business, but the very small micro businesses, we're campaigning for access to local recycling resources, make it easier for them to do the recycling and the waste collection. The local recycling centers, they're also obviously just reserved for domestic users. It's simple things that could actually help them facilitate that. On business rates, for instance, that was something we were really happy to have the Chancellor announce. There's the business rates relief now that when you invest in green investment, you can then, the value of your business goes up, but you don't have to pay more for that. It's things like that you set the right, you put them on the right path and you facilitate the change instead of putting up barriers.
What counts as a green investment for a micro business that would entitle you to rates relief?
Anything from solar panels to heat pumps. So any of the insulation is another one. It's any improvement that you make to your business that usually would then entail that your business rates would increase because your business has improved, insulation has improved, hence your property has improved. That obviously puts the rate up, but that's obviously not in facilitating the green agenda in that sense.
And are the savings from the rate relief sufficient to for example, pay for a ground source heat pump, or is it not a big upfront cost? Are there schemes to amortize that?
There's still the upfront cost is still a problem. So we see obviously the business rate relief is an opportunity. So you don't have that barrier, but the cost is still an issue. And obviously we've seen a lot of announcement during COP from NatWest, obviously HSBC. There are a lot of announcement for SME focused grants now. We've put something else forward to the government. It's the Help to Green scheme, based around the Help to Grow scheme that was launched for the digital agenda. Just the opportunity, it's a £5,000 voucher for businesses to make the investment in solar panels or any other green investment, even just getting an audit, for instance, on your carbon emissions. We understand that business rates, obviously the business rates release is one aspect, but you still need the grants, or at least it's not necessarily free money, but it's facilitate the way, you can access funding and grants in order to actually make the green move.
That's a proposal that you have made to the Treasury rather than the other way around.
Yeah, the help to green is something we put forward in the report, and I think a lot of other organizations may have picked up on this one as well. Just it's based on the help to grow scheme, which obviously seems to be working quite well. But the help to grow scheme at the moment, I think it's still not below 5 employees. So we want to have that, expanded to everybody who are sole traders, micro businesses.
Okay, and as mentioned, I'm really interested to know how many of your members regard this as a business opportunity. You'll have heard in big business, all the chat is, guys, unless you're in extraction or oil and gas, you should be regarding this as the next big bonanza. If you are a 5 or 6 person building firm, are those kinds of members beginning to see this as a real opportunity?
It depends who you talk to. I think it has not yet fully trickled down to everybody, because there are barriers in order to see that as an opportunity. We do the business we talk to that have made the changes. There are businesses that have been sustainable for many, many years now, even decades, who've been on that sustainability agenda for a while. They see it as an opportunity. It's just also something, it's something you would like to do. You do something good for environment, but you also see the benefits with your customers. With the businesses, as you mentioned, the building firm, for instance, there is recognition that, for instance, retrofitting homes is an opportunity, but I think it's not yet fully understood how much that will actually affect small businesses. So something we are campaigning for is that the government should advocate this. They, demonstrate the opportunities to small businesses, provide them with the skills, with the tools in order to, for instance, get more skills, get more experience in retrofitting properties with what's the word? Hydrogen pumps. So it's a kind of like giving them the opportunities, or demonstrating these are the opportunities, and then giving them the tools in order to make use of these opportunities. We do, as I said, it's at the moment we have the business that recognize it and see it's a great opportunity. But I think there's a lot of talk about this is going to be expensive. This is going to be a major challenge. A lot of businesses still see that as like, I have to measure my carbon footprint. There's still a lot of question of what do I really need to do? It's more of like there's a lot of tasks that come towards them, but tying that together with the opportunities, that's the way forward.
But is there finally a clear distinction in your minds and your members' minds between shrinking your carbon footprint, whatever business you're in, and the rather separate challenge, well, to my mind, but maybe I'm wrong, of how do I maybe change the focus of my business to take advantage of what we're told is a multi-trillion pound new dawn? I mean, you've got to be pretty flexible, haven't you, to actually change direction, to tap into these new capital flows that we're told are coming.
Yes, and it's obviously it was a very, very difficult 2 years that we've now, the small business community has experienced with COVID. However, it's not something positive. I don't want to say it's something positive, but it's something has demonstrated again the agility, the flexibility of small businesses. So we've seen they had to adapt. We've seen an increase of small businesses launching their websites, marketing through social media. So they have adapted to the situation. I'm obviously, hopefully this is, we're passing through COVID, and hopefully we'll see normality return sooner rather than later for small businesses. But they've demonstrated that they can think outside the box, and because they are so small and they don't have a big HR department or stakeholders involved, or shareholders, they can make the decisions together with their employees. There are a lot of businesses that work together with their employees. The employees bring in new incentives, new ideas into how the business could be more sustainable. So on that sense, small businesses could be better and quicker to adapt than the larger businesses. And actually, if you give them the right tools and take them on board and show them the opportunities, and put the right policy frameworks in place, then it's still going to be a difficult undertaking. It depends, obviously. If you're a very high energy intensive business, the challenge obviously to become more energy efficient is way higher than if you're a micro business working from home and you can tap into your your home heating, but there are ways to be innovative, to think forward.
Thank you very much. Let's try and make sure that we have time to come back to drill down a bit on what the right policy frameworks are. But first, let me come to Stephen Lorimer. I missed a bit of the chat before we started. Were you in Glasgow?
I was in Glasgow.
Yes.
Yes, we brushed past each other, Giles, but we never got to speak.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
In the funky New York Times climate hub.
In that warehouse area, yes, of course. It was supremely decorated, I do have to say.
Yeah, and we were probably wearing masks, so I don't think we need to feel awkward about that. Look, I'm really interested in your overall impression, since you're from the Centre for Net Zero, and so sort of your core focus was pretty closely aligned with that of the whole conference. So I'd be interested in your general impression of whether it was a success or not, where it ranks in the annals of COPs, but also the Centre for Net Zero has been doing some interesting modelling, and I'd love you to tell us about that, because we have these endless conversations about the transition, the energy transition. And in some sectors it's begun, in other sectors it's yet to. I don't have any idea who the winners and losers are going to be, and maybe you can tell us. But your overall impressions first, Steve.
My overall impressions. So I do have to admit, it actually was my first COP. It wasn't my first big conference, or even kind of at times it actually felt like a trade fair. If you went to the green zone, those who were there because of the sponsorship implications and that sort of thing. But my overall impressions was it was big, but if you were something that was there, it was doable as a conference, if you will. That you'd be able to meet people that were there. It wasn't an actually impossible task to try to get some influence and try to connect with the people that you wanted to be with, even if you didn't have a pass for the blue zone. That wasn't a total exclusionary thing, even though when you talk to, for example, when we talked to like the leader of Glasgow Council, she said practically there's two COPs going on, one inside the blue zone and one that's everyone else. And what's really interesting is that for those of us that are very interested in what happens outside of national government, what happens inside cities, that there's lots of loud and clear voices that are were mostly outside of the blue zone. And because our research is very focused on the decarbonization of heat and transport, of course, that's concentrated mostly within cities, and then we consider that a lot of our stakeholders. And I think one of the things I found that, of course, we were there at Cities Day, and I remember, Giles, you saying that the panel that you ran on Cities Day was the most engaged that you had out of all of them. For those of us who were all kind of, we used to work inside the architecture and urban planning worlds out there, and we do a lot of modeling of who will take up heat pumps soon, who are the owner-occupiers, landlords, others in the residential sector, and of course in the commercial sector that you talked about just now before. And one thing that really struck me during that time was there's this huge job that's out there in the developed world to retrofit all the buildings that are out there. And I think one of the people that's on the panel, I think his name is Jens Bergensen from Rockwall. He said, actually, there's been this focus on skills, of white collar skills, and people like me who have PhDs and getting them into university. But what are those tech-enabled blue-collar jobs that actually will enable it to happen in the future? And that kind of struck me as something that is a tough conversation to have with those who are in charge of those budgets. Another thing that struck me during that time was, if you remember Jennifer Lake from the WRI, the World Resources Institute, she came and say, actually, those of us and those who don't know on here, that we're owned by an energy supplier, Octopus Energy, who of course are a very relatively new in the market, about 6 years old, but have always been like very dedicated towards renewable energy being being the future, even to the point now of being a manager of investments into renewable energy projects across the UK is one of their lines of business. And you said the whole customer experience that happens in the building sector and retrofit is completely wrong at the moment. Everyone just gets too frustrated about the whole switch over from gas boilers into heat pumps as one example, but give that as one example as many of the kind of transitions that we need to have, and how utility companies need to be involved in financing of retrofit, need to be involved in green mortgages in the future. And really the statement, she said that energy suppliers really need to be sellers of services and not sellers of just kilowatt hours. And I think that could apply to many of the industries involved in the energy transition. It's just the one that's always been closest to me because I trained as an urban planner and worked with building physicists for a long time. And of course, I was there on Cities Day. There's lots of chat around mobility. And there's things that can improve in the future. There's still a lot of talk around what happened after all the talk around autonomous vehicles. That's turned a lot into digital connectivity and progressive charging for of roads, to be able to limit the amount of travel that happens on them. And of course, many that were involved in the transport sector, dedicated towards active travel and transport planning, they did complain a lot that the representatives of designers, designers of electric vehicles, those who are part of the manufacturing industry, really dominated the conversation. And those of us that got educated in transport planning, we got taught the very first rule of transport planning is first limit the need to travel in the first place. And I think in the heating sector and cooling sector, there's lots of talk about trying to limit the demand side response and the energy grid and that side of things. But that's been there the whole time in the transport sector, and it's paradoxically slipping further away in the conversations that have been happening around the transition from internal combustion engine vehicles into EVs, which I found very fascinating as something that's changed in the conversation. I mean, I remember being in the Climate Hub and saw Thomas Heatherwick, that was there on a panel with Shirley Rodriguez, who's the Deputy Mayor of London, who I used to work with when I was at the GLA. And he seemed almost sheepish in the way that he was talking about himself as a designer of electric vehicles, like it almost shouldn't have been allowed to happen, but he was there and going to take advantage of the market was there, and he is a designer and that sort of thing. And that was kind of a fascinating dynamic to see.
Did you feel that was because he'd kind of heard the argument that if everyone's driving around in 2-ton vehicles that are much bigger than they are, that even if they are EVs, they're still kind of part of the problem? Is that the sense that you got, that he was trying to acknowledge?
I think he was acknowledging as somebody who was an architect that's always designed for cities. I mean, he designed like the new double-decker bus, the Via the Bang, all those types of pieces of architecture in cities, and been a city dweller his whole life. So he knows the whole argument around that one-to-one transition is probably difficult to happen. And it's difficult for the flexibility of the grid to happen as well. Because one thing that we were quite fascinated by was a conversation we had at the Open UK Summit, which we were a sponsor of, that happened on the fringes of COP. And one of the things that they released was trying to imagine what carbon negative data centers were going to be in the future. And actually, data centers are 1% of the world's electricity use now, and ever growing all the time. We all operate in the cloud. And there was kind of questions that are out there, and especially around how do you actually harness things like on-site generation, other kinds of electricity flexibility to actually be able to feed these data centers, because they're not going away anytime soon. And so one of the things that we work on a lot is thinking about, well, if you're going to be putting on-site generation such as solar or even see electric vehicle batteries as generation, because they're being filled up at times that are cheap and being discharged, possibly even discharged. It's called vehicle to grid technology, and Octopus actually are running a trial with Tesla and one of the price schemes that they have right now on how that might work in the future of actually discharging it when it's expensive and charging it again when it's cheap, and to be able to help you balance the grid and not totally over engineer the transition from internal combustion engines and gas boilers into heat pumps and to electric vehicles in the future. Because when you talk to national grids, I mean, I talked to a couple of representatives when I was there, and a lot of their attitude is, well, we'll just do what we always done, which is engineer a new electricity grid according to demand, just let demand guide the amount of investment that we say is needed, add 30% because we're engineers, and add it to everyone's bills because that's what we've always done. And that, I mean, that almost seems unfair for that to be part of the energy transition. We can be smarter than that. We can actually design things where people do charge their cars at 1, 2 in the morning. We've always done it with electric heating and like our water cylinders. Why can't it be the same with electric vehicles? You know, this pattern of charging between 4 and 7 in the afternoon when you get home. That should be a thing in the past. If we can build smart chargers that can do it. We've been building price plans in Octopus Energy called, for example, Go for a while to be able to get people to respond to that. And
so can I just ask about that? Yeah. Those conversations with grid engineers, were they just talking about, we understand that there will be a net demand for increased capacity and we will meet that demand, but we're still not thinking about smart grids, distributed generation at all?
Well, of course they are thinking about it,
right?
But they're thinking, well, let's just not count on it in a way, and think that everyone's going to have the same demand profile over each 24-hour period that they've always had, and people would just be willing to pay for it because that's when they need electricity. And if the grid has pressure, we'll just over-engineer it like we always have, right? And put it onto everyone's bills. And I think that nobody really wants that if we can avoid it, but it's a hard job ahead of us to get there.
Right. There are a number of specific points that I wanted to come back on, but there's a general one, which is that everything that we've been talking about, that you've been talking about in the last 5 minutes, is kind of non-core COP business. And a real facet of COP was how many of the headlines were cleverly, carefully generated outside the core COP agenda. The whole, as we heard from Sam Alvis during the conference and before, actually, the whole coal cars, cash trees thing was manufactured and prepared in advance to ensure that there would be broadly positive headlines, regardless of what went on in the big tents of the blue zone. Is it your impression, and there's no question that a lot of what was achieved outside that core process, which is fairly arcane except to regular COP goers. But is it your impression that COP was more useful for what happened outside than inside, as it were?
It was, like I said before, it was a story of two different things happening at once. Yeah. I mean, I would say that arguably the biggest win kind of for the COP process happening in the blue zone is that the agreement that the climate plans that national governments had to submit was moved up by 3 years practically. Yeah. Saying we're not going to do it in 2025 like we've been talking about. We're going to do it in 2022. Yeah. That's actually quite fast. But of course, it was in response to a lot of the work that's been done over the last couple of years. Of many more countries have added climate plans that didn't have them before. And some of the side agreements that have been made. I mean, I'll give one in our area, around one of our kind of specialist areas around electric vehicles, that 34 countries have said that by 2040, we will not have internal combustion engines anymore. We'll go to electric vehicles. And I think there was, Glasgow's job was not to say the words net zero again, like the Paris agreements, or not to say kind of why we're doing this, because that's already been settled, but how we're going to do it. It was about detail.
Yeah.
And trying to achieve that detail, of course, is quite difficult. And there was, some kicking it down the road in some instances, but there was an agreement that actually there's enough detail, there's enough technologies that are available to roll out now that we should feel confident in, and not kind of waiting for a fairy godmother of a new technology to come and save the day. We have the ones that are are available. We can roll them out. And two examples that I was talking about were, that others have talked about as well around heat pumps, electric vehicles. There's a couple of examples, but there are more that we can go through in other sectors as well, in the marine sector, in the solar sector, et cetera.
Thank you, Stephen. In a second, I'd love to come to Chris Ettery, because I'd like to hear more about why you regard it overall as disappointing. But Stephen, just to pick up on one of the points of detail, you said that, if I understood you right, that utility companies need to get involved not just in providing energy, but providing services, including finance for heat pumps, if that's what we need to move away from gas-powered boilers. We've just today reported on bulb going to the wall. There is one energy company that is not just not equipped to help people with any finance, but in bankruptcy. How do you square the demand that the need that you identified for energy companies to basically do more to help their customers through their personal transitions, with the vulnerability of many of those companies, except the very few very big ones?
And I think the second part of what I said in that statement is that quote that I had from Jennifer Lake from the WRI was that it must become sellers of services, but not just kilowatt hours.
Right.
And I think the argument's been made of many of those suppliers that went to the wall. And even I think when you see the quotes about bulb that are out there, is that that they kind of just mostly were operating on the basis that they were selling kilowatt hours as cheaply as possible to try to win the market, but moving on to actually seeing themselves as made that kind of diversified building a service. For example, we are part of a group where they have smart meter suppliers, heat pump installers, electric vehicle fleets, managing renewable energy investments, building CRMs to be able to manage all of these kind of relationships and trading on microgrids and all the new concepts that need to happen in the future. Those are all contained within and ourselves, of course, who are an open research lab for kind of the fair and just and affordable energy transition that are built out as well. So the ability of energy suppliers to, for example, be involved with helping at the very least signpost people towards that finance, right. Making that it's less risk than they thought before. I think there were a couple of things that were mentioned in that discussion around what happens if somebody's not an owner-occupier, somebody who doesn't have that kind of power and wealth that are out there. Those are the things that you really need to speak with government, with social and kind of public housing providers that need to get involved. How do they get the financing involved with that? How do they get the trust in the people that they house, that their rents, which is one of their bills, doesn't get put up to pay for that capital cost too quickly and too unjustly to make that happen? Where are energy suppliers in the middle of that? There's a good argument they should.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Can we come to Chris? Hello.
Hi, Giles.
Hi, welcome. What disappointed you about Glasgow?
Well, look, I think there's a good collection of individual agreements put on the table, but I think sort of having been based in Paris around the time of COP21 and been involved in it from a private sector point of view, I do know that 2 years before COP21, the French government had a whole team deployed to work with individual countries to ensure that they're able to get the agreement to 1.5 that they were seeking. And they were working for 2 years with different countries and with different companies to ensure that when they actually came to the meeting itself, I mean, I was present at COP21, I wasn't present at COP26. To be honest, I didn't have a lot of enthusiasm to go to COP26 because I know generally they're slightly chaotic affairs outside of the blue zone. But you know, I felt that, you know, with the UK, there was never any possibility of having a really big announcement come from it because they simply didn't have the resource and the runway to be able to drive to that level of agreement. And I think, you know, that's been the case that we've seen at previous COPs, like the COP before in Copenhagen. And unfortunately, I expect it to be the same when we get to Saudi Arabia next year, which is
Egypt, I think.
These things, Egypt, sorry, you know, that there's just no, you know, these things take a hell of a lot of diplomacy, and it needs more than just a sort of 9-month tour of the world by a small team to kind of make these things executed. I would also kind of say that to a certain extent, I think we have to be realistic in terms of just how much COP can deliver, because it gives us an annual point where it's a level setting in terms of where we are with different countries and their approach to it. But I would be probably a little bit different than the panelists, in that I think from a sustainability point of view, the driver now is much more the market than regulations and central government providing infrastructure to drive to more sustainable solutions. I mean, from where I can see, you know, the world has changed, it's pivoted in terms of demand for businesses and organizations to operate more sustainably. And I think, you know, from the work that I do, I think it's more a question that businesses now need to alter their strategy to ensure that's taken into account, so they're in a position to compete in that market in the future, rather than looking at all the individual costs. I mean, we made the example of heat pumps. Now, I'm sure for the majority of businesses, heat pumps really aren't a material issue they need to worry about. I'm sure there's much more material impacts on the environment that are easier to integrate and would provide, like most sustainability initiatives, would provide very effective revenue return once you've invested in it.
May I ask what area you do work in, and also which you can answer or not, depending on whether you want to, but more particularly, what have you read or seen that persuades you that for the private sector at least, or big bits of it, this is now an opportunity?
So I work in the technology sector. And so, you know, I align with the comments in terms of, you know, the need to manage the carbon footprints for data centers and the demand on that. But I would look at it slightly differently than thinking about this. There's a kind of how we regulate energy providers to ensure that we're getting a more fair supply of green energy. And I would look at it more that this level, there's going to be huge demand from technology companies and all types of energy users for more green demand. And so to a certain extent, that's going to drive the changes that we're all hoping for. Sorry, you're getting a cameo from my daughter. So, you know, I kind of feel that it's less in terms of looking around, looking for other people to take the leadership, and more for companies themselves to be able to notice where the material impacts are, because very often their customers are going to be looking for them to make those changes. So whether it's, you know, being able to decarbonize data centers, whether it's in terms of being able to engage more fully in the circular economy. You know, I happen to be very aligned with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation view that climate change is essentially 55% energy efficiency, 45% processing and preparation of materials. And so, you know, I think there's much more opportunity for companies to look at it in a more view of where our material impacts and how do we take leadership on these, rather than waiting for central government or other organizations to provide incentives.
But in the same breath, you're saying there is still a huge role for regulatory agencies to set the goalposts, to set the incentives right.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of regulations that are coming into the market anyway, I think, Giles. I mean, you look in the EU, I mean, they've got, you know, an awful lot of different regulations coming in, be it sustainable corporate governance proposals or sustainable products initiative. I mean, there's lots of regulations coming in. I'd be more of the view of the danger we face with that is less that they will drive the right behaviors, but it will be more likely to lead to, you know, probably non-harmonized rules between EU requirements and what they want at a member state level, which might not actually deliver the better sustainability results we want, but will actually involve companies then having to juggle if they're working in multiple markets. How do they meet a requirement that might be set up in France, but might not be the case in Poland? All
right, thank you. Can we come, I'm sorry, I've given no warning, to Glyn Skerritt, Dr. Glyn Skerritt? I'm intrigued when you say that the exoptimist is increasingly dominant. Presumably that's the pessimist, right?
Pragmatist.
Pragmatist. And you're saying we need to be clear what plus 1.8 to 2.9 actually looks like in the consequences. Is this an argument for sort of diverting attention and funding from mitigation to adaptation?
No, it's not an argument for it. It's really trying to cater for, I guess, what seems increasingly to me to be the potential eventuality that 1.5 will end up being beyond our grasp.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, financial things like this are often considered, as perhaps your question implied, even if you didn't mean it as such, as a zero-sum game. So if we take it away from technology development or increased scaling of existing resources, renewable resources, then that means we can't spend as much on adaptation and resilience. I would hope it wasn't a zero-sum game, but whilst in no way would I want to detract from the technology development and the rollout and deployment, I just feel we have to be realistic. I feel very guilty about this because given the age I am, that you can see, it really won't affect me so much, but it will affect my kids and it'll affect my grandkids. And it's for them that I feel sorry, in the sense that I just get the way things are politically and the lack of collective human motivation to really get a grip on this thing in time.
I hear you. Can I just put to you very briefly as a glass half full slash invested politician booster view, namely $130 trillion out there in search of ESG investments, real progress towards agreement on what I believe they called Article 6, a framework for the deployment of private sector funds on a massive scale in sort of afforestation and offsets, I'll say the word. Is there not still a chance, a decent chance, that if funds on that scale are mobilized in that direction, we could still surprise ourselves? One of the conversations, and then I'll be quiet, that really struck me that I took part in early on was with a scientist from Exeter who has switched from studying natural tipping points in the biosphere to social tipping points amongst humans, behavioral tipping points, and he's trying to bring the same scientific rigor into measuring them, and was quite optimistic obviously, you know, his examples are uptake of solar, uptake of EVs, that kind of thing, on an exponential trend. Could we not surprise ourselves?
I listened with great interest to that conversation you had with the prof from Exeter. Yeah, we could surprise ourselves. And I genuinely hope we do. But the ex-optimist screams out inside me that one needs to be pragmatic about these things. And your boosterism is surpassed by certain individuals who seem to have made a career out of it. And as long as that superficial level, if I can express a personal opinion, that superficial level of grasp of the magnitude of the issues that are facing us maintains, I just don't see how collectively, even with industry, with the market operating increasingly towards our favour. I say our as a champion of maintaining 1.5. I just don't see, with the kind of boosterism that's going on and the tokenism that goes on with respect to implementation of well, first of all, producing genuine policies and pathways that will deliver on pledges, and then actually enacting that and taking everyone, the public, industry, everyone along together. I just don't see that level of interwoven commitment, which is, I just feel that's increasingly slipping away from us, and therefore 1.5 is increasingly slipping away from us.
Fair enough. I hear your call for pragmatism. Before we run out of time, I'd love to come to my colleagues, Ellen and Phoebe, to get your take on reporting that we should be doing separate from the promises we've already made. And then I hope we can come back to Friederike, because I did say that we wanted to talk about the policy frameworks that might help your members at the Federation for Small Business. Who's going first? Ellen.
Hello.
Hi. What should we do?
I think that I do find the conversation about investment in adaptation and investment in technologies to mitigation a really interesting one. I think something that I sort of mentioned to you earlier, Giles, that I am interested in doing is talking about all of that we already need to do. We already need to do in terms of adaptation, not just in sort of closer to home, and maybe some of the stories that we can tell there, whether it's about the kind of insulation points that we've talked about, whether it's about sea level rising or flood protection from rivers to protect people from what happened in Germany in the summer. Maybe these kinds of stories are a useful way to also kind of change people's behavior in the parts of the world where the emissions are, the consumer emissions are the greatest and so on. So I sort of wonder if that conversation about adaptation can also serve a purpose. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in, and I'm kind of starting to do some work on a piece, hopefully, about sort of what the UK is doing well in terms of adaptation and where it can do a lot better.
Are there people who say that we're heading for a Rhone-style flood disaster?
Well, I think that I spoke to someone from the Environment Agency today who said, there are some small communities and some, there are people whose homes cannot be protected from locked in impacts of climate change that we're already seeing that will only get worse. And some of those people aren't aware of that. And there's a huge amount of money tied up in there in terms of insurance and all sorts. So yeah, I mean, that's just on one thing, right? That's just on flooding. which is apparently the area that we're doing best in on adaptation. So
Right. No, but it's a really interesting question that you posed. You don't want anyone to lose their home to a flood, but the extent to which events like those in Germany last year might serve as a wake-up call to a whole country and lead ultimately to policy changes in the right direction. Thanks, Ellen. Phoebe, what's in your notebook?
There's a couple of things, and also it's really interesting hearing conversations around investment and how we do this, and something we were chatting about earlier was things like the Green Homes Grant, which came up in one of the thinkings and the kind of failures there in kind of putting that forward the way that it was put forward to industry, the way that they worked with industry. If you didn't know, it was a chunky bit of investment towards insulation and kind of home renovation, and then it was kind of cut short 6 months later, because it all just kind of was fumbled through. But Kate Bingham was just speaking about the vaccine kind of rollout and the way that kind of policy works, and the way that you kind of get the investment arm to work with the ministerial arm, and the way that all set up, and, you know, thinking forward, like Ellen said, to the future, you know, what's going to happen next time. And I think it's sometimes a bit lazy of a comparison to compare, you know, COVID and climate, but I think she made some really valid points about how science needs to work with business. So I've been thinking about that, and I think there's some work worth doing on the Green Homes Grant and the failure there. And I think it was one of the most animated discussions we had over COP. So I think that's where worth doing a bit more work on.
Thank you. I noticed Tom and Barney agreeing with each other in the chat on questions of money and potential misuse of this money. Tom, I'd be really interested to know how seriously you take that 130 trillion figure.
Not very seriously. I mean, I have no expertise on it, but even if it's a third of that, it's still a colossal amount of money. And although, of course, I'd like to see lots of money going in, it just seems to me the dangers of massive leakage and corruption, and of financial systems in many countries being overwhelmed and not able to handle it. So I'd like someone to do a reverse Glyn Skerritt on this and reassure me that there's an optimistic picture on this.
Can you give an example of a specific type of corruption that you're talking about?
No, I can't. But I'm just aware as a lay person of some of the dangers of corruption in countries which, well, leaving aside our own country for the moment, but which just are not used to handling very large sums of money, and might have to do it in ways that there are very poorly established criteria and institutions. I mean, I am just thinking of the, you don't have to look at Afghanistan and see what happened to the development and aid money that went there.
So let me just ask, would you regard, if IAG, the parent company of British Airways, said we have paid $100 million this year towards the protection of forest in the southern Amazon, and then it emerged that 50 million of those dollars had actually gone into the pockets of big Brazilian landowners, but that one upshot of the scheme was that you could still point to areas of the map where trees were still standing where they might not otherwise have been.
Sure.
Would you regard that as legitimate use of British Airways passengers' money? Well,
only in a rather heavily qualified way. And I suppose I'm just saying, I think we need already to be alert to the ways in which it could go wrong, and to develop as strongly as we can mechanisms for making sure that it's not just accountable, but it's used in the right way. And there are international institutions, some of which are very, very competent. But it's I suppose it's just an issue I've become more aware of in the light of some of the self-congratulation about these colossal sums of money.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I'm skeptical, but again, as a layperson, Friederike, before we run out of time, we were talking about policy frameworks that might help your members, and I don't know if it's helpful to think sort of separately in terms of the twin goals of small businesses shrinking their own footprints and small businesses pivoting to new business opportunities, or whether you package all that together. But what are the single or perhaps a couple of particular policy innovations that you would really press on the government? I mean, you mentioned the Help to Green scheme. Are there any others?
Yes, there are a couple. Just to go back to, you always refer to as like the FSB members. I think it's important for us that as FSB, we're always trying to speak on behalf of all small businesses. Obviously not saying everybody is a member, but just when we make policy recommendations, we also think about the members that are not the members. We also think about the business that are not necessarily members of FSB. Our events are open for non-members. We always have an open door when they have any questions, especially during COVID. 99% of businesses in the UK are small businesses, so below 250 employees. So everybody, when you walk down the street now, you'll see them everywhere. You see them. These are the businesses that are really important in this transition. We did come together as a B5, all the big 5 business organizations last year, and we came up with something that's called the 5 fairness principles. I can mention a couple more other specific policy areas, but what we always say is when it comes to businesses, it has to be the new legislations or the path to net zero should be ambitious. It should be accountable. It should think about the different types of businesses that are out there, from like a manufacturing business to a hairdresser to a consultant and accounting firm. It should have the opportunities. As you said, is it just opportunities? But there are a lot of opportunities. But then at the same time, it should also be financeable. So from our side, the opportunities of becoming more energy efficient, that's an opportunity as a business in the way that you can save money. So you do something good for your business because you're saving money. You may be able to invest in something new and actually invest in training in order to retrofit buildings or insulate buildings. So it's all interlinked. It's all you can't see the things in isolation. You can't look at business in isolation. They're part of supply chains. They have to work together. So if we look at it in a way of collaboration, the bigger businesses help the smaller businesses, small businesses among themselves can support each other and give advice. And it's interesting that, especially on the net zero agenda, we've seen that a lot of businesses are happy to share how they've done it already. That's why we have the webinars with businesses speaking about their experience. And I think that's something also that came through COP this year, which we've seen the UK government has now realized that small businesses are vital. 99% of businesses are small businesses, micro businesses. That's why they've launched the SME Climate Hub. That's why they had the COP ambassadors, where I think about half of the COP ambassadors that were there were actually small businesses. They had small businesses speaking at COP26. They hosted a range of webinars that we've participated in as well. And seeing that as like, we help you to make the transition, but you can also be part of that, that opportunity. And maybe a bit too, I know there was a lot of like worry about, climate change, but there's a lot of opportunities still there. Right. And thinking about small business, I know how they've, came through this pandemic and, they're still, they're already innovative. And I feel like we should, be very kind of trying to be a bit positive as well about net zero can be also something good in that sense.
Thank you very much. Stephen, I want to give you the last word. Time does fly. Normally at this point, we sort of take a step back and try to go big picture, but I think on this particular occasion, I want to stay granular. You have on your website this amazing map of the UK divided up into regions where you can hover over them and see these 4 metrics, how many charge points per 1,000. I forget what all the other ones are, but there's a very stark difference between the top 5 and the bottom 5, which swim past you on the screen. Yeah. What and they're all in Scotland, the ones with a lot of what's the key comparator? Anyway,
three in the room in Scotland, 2 in the room in England. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. What it's a similar sort of question to the one I asked Friederike. What are the key recommendations you would make to bring the rest to level up in terms of the transition that we all have to make in terms of ground source of non-gas sustainable heating, access to recharging? What does the government need to do?
What do they need to do? Well, the reason why you saw those top ones is that right now the government is depending on those who already have own land and have power already. Those are places where people are owner occupiers in their own home, and it's low-hanging fruit that and recruiting them in the first place. So they actually need to up the amount of collaboration that's out there between government, the commercial sector, freeholders, and local government, because that's the only way to be able to access all those people that live in flats, all those people that don't have their own parking spaces, all the different people that manage those on behalf of those that live there, and all the ones that manage all the businesses that are involved as well. Because I think businesses haven't been involved in the conversation, apart from, for example, if they're getting an electric fleet or something at a very large scale. And those are the kinds of things that government do need to be able to push forward to increase that. And well, frankly, a lot of it has to do with, well, in the UK context, devolution is something which is very incomplete, very kind of lack of power of those who are further down the chain that actually have to go and implement all these changes, because those who are delivering the services are not national governments, but those who are actually setting the rules and the power are definitely in central government. And I think it's something that's repeated across every country in the world, really. Yeah.
Too true. Thank you so much. We're 3 minutes over. I've really just started the process of underlining great nuggets of wisdom in my notes, but I hear you, Ellen and Phoebe, on flood protection, on adaptation stories as a way of sort of looking backwards through the telescope at the original problem, on what went wrong with the Green Grant, what might replace it. Just now, Stephen, on the overwhelming and urgent need to put people in rented flats in the same position as owner occupiers are at the moment in this transition. Chris made the point that we're going to have huge energy demands from tech companies, and that might be the driver of the transition as a market opportunity that we've been talking about. And Stephen, you made the point earlier on that the biggest single win probably from the blue zone in terms of core COP priorities was this ratchet that is going to bring everybody back to with new NDCs, new nationally determined contributions by next year in Egypt. And we heard from Friederike about the challenges that face small businesses, which can also be opportunities as simple as saving money on energy bills. Thank you all very much. This is a work in progress. We are going to keep our promise to produce that easily laminated to-do list, informed by sessions like this and COP. And we're going to distill it to a few irreducible points, and we're going to carry on hosting these think-ins for the Net Zero Coalition and for Tortoise members. But thank you very much for joining us for this one, and see you next time.